You're listening to the Critical Hour. I'm Wilmer Leon, and I'm joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Middle East Eye reports Nobel-winning Hiroshima survivors' Gaza comparison angers Israel. Toshiyuki Mimaki said Gaza workers deserved a Nobel Prize for his organization after his organization was given the award. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Israel has attacked a prominent survivor of the Hiroshima atomic bombing over a comparison he made between the blast and the current assault on Gaza. Toshiyuki Mimaki, a leader of the Nihon Hidankyo organization that represents survivors of the U.S. attack, compared the two after the group was announced as the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize on Friday. Your thoughts, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, this story has two strands. One, the growing disenchantment in Japan, one of the so-called U.S. allies, particularly the linchpin in the Pacific, and the other, the growing disenchantment with U.S. allies with regard to U.S. support for the piratical regime in Israel. With regard to the former question, we see that the current prime minister of Japan, recently inaugurated, and of course he's facing elections by the end of the month, has raised serious and searching questions about the military alliance. He's even raised the question of extraterritoriality. Recall that the United States has a kind of extraterritoriality allowing it to oversee offenses committed by its troops in Okinawa. He, speaking of Mr. Shiba, has raised the question of why that cannot be transferred to Japanese troops who are somehow under the U.S. flag. He was thinking of Guam. Perhaps we should not rule out San Francisco. And secondly, there's the Nippon Steel deal. You know that Nippon Steel was trying to buy steel enterprises in the United States of America. I would suggest that chauvinism of the rankest sort has prevented that deal from going through, and it has rankled sentiments in Japan, complicating the alliance between Tokyo and Washington. And of course, the overriding question is the fact that the United States used nuclear weapons in Japan in 1945. Although that may have been forgotten on this side of the Atlantic, it's certainly not been forgotten in Japan, raising questions about the fragility of this alliance. And I should also say that as a U.S. ally, the United States has forced Japan to toe the line with regard to its policy in Ukraine, for example, which at the same time complicates Japan's relations with Russia, which are very complex. Japan would like to see the return of the Kuril Islands, which Russia or the Soviet Union seized post-1945, and negotiations seem to be going along rather swimmingly until the United States forced Japan to stand to attention with regard to supporting the U.S. war in Ukraine. So we also see that Japan feels that if Mr. Trump returns to office in January of 2025, that he will further seek to improve relations with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which has a grievance against Japan going back to Japan's brutal colonial occupation of the Korean Peninsula beginning in 1910. And as well, this U.S. crackdown on Beijing is complicating the massive Japanese investments in the People's Republic of China. And there is some worry and concern that Japan, or at least Japanese corporate interests, may have to take a haircut as a result, that is to say, suffer and endure sharp financial losses as relations between Beijing and Washington suffer and endure a downturn. So this question of Israel is one of many questions that is complicating relations between Tokyo and Washington. And turning to the second strand, it's not only Japan as a U.S. ally that is quite concerned about this all-out U.S. support for Israel. Recall that France has called for an arms embargo against Israel, which brought a sharp rebuke from Prime Minister Netanyahu. He has been backed to a greater or lesser degree by other European nations such as Spain, Norway, and Ireland. The Mediterranean nations, including Italy, have raised sharp questions about Israel's attack on United Nations peacekeeping forces in Lebanon, not to mention Israel's recent attacks in the last 24 to 48 hours on Lebanese Christian communities who have had close relations with France in particular, not to mention the other Mediterranean nations such as Italy, stretching back to the so-called Sykes-Picot Agreement following World War I, which divvied up Lebanon and giving a portion of Lebanon to France. Now, there is also a concern that if Israel attacks Iran, which apparently is planning to do, that it will cause a jump in the price of oil. Already, the European nations have had to endure a jump in the price of natural gas because, once again, of going along with the U.S. escapade in Ukraine before they were getting natural gas in profusion from Russia. But sanctions has helped to hamper that particular process. And we have not even talked about the reaction on the Arab street with regard to U.S. support for Israel, how that's complicating European investments in the Arab countries, particularly in Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Arab states in particular, not to mention how it's complicating the tenure of university presidents, a number of whom have been forced to resign, including the president of Columbia University, who not only resigned but left the country. And so there is good reason for peace forces in Japan to be concerned about this slow motion genocide we see unfolding in Gaza, now extended to Lebanon, because their concern reflects and mirrors concerns amongst other U.S. allies, not to mention the peace and democratic forces in the United States of America itself.
Our next story is about Africa, but since we are up against, maybe up against the hour, I certainly wanted to give you an opportunity to say something if you choose. You know, as you know, we've been sanctioned out of business, shall we say. This is going to be our last show, and we certainly appreciate having you on. And, you know, we look forward, both of us, having our own other options that we're doing to working with you again. But did you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Horne?
And before you respond, let me add to that how appreciative we are, and I know I can speak for Garland on this one, because as appreciative as we are for all of the guests that we have, we know coming on this show for many is a decision that has to be made, and you have been one of the intellectual stalwarts on this show that has always made the show what it is, and unfortunately, after tomorrow, what it was. So we honor you, we love you, we respect you, Dr. Horne.
Well, I find it hard to believe. I guess that's naive on my part that Sputnik is disappearing from the airwaves. This, if it takes place, and I remain convinced that we can rescue Sputnik, despite what I've read in the press about its demise. But if I am incorrect, this is a major defeat for peace forces, this is a major defeat for anti-imperialist forces, a major defeat for anti-racist forces, a major defeat for democratic forces. And I'm afraid to say it probably brings this small planet ever closer to the horrors of a possible World War III.
Well, I will only say to you, and who am I to push back against Dr. Gerald Horne? I don't consider it a defeat. It is a tremendous setback, but we know that the truth crushed to earth shall rise again. And I know that people will be able to hear you with Garland on his show. They'll be able to on YouTube as well as WPFW. They will continue to be able to hear you on my shows on Connecting the Dots on YouTube as well as on Sirius XM Radio. So again, the truth crushed to earth shall rise again. And hey, man, we aren't going anywhere. We just moved to a different spot.
That being said, one more article. The outgoing U.S. leader, Biden, has not prioritized Africa enough. Some say, well, those some sure aren't Africans, as Russia and China make inroads into the continent. Dr. Horne.
Well, as you know, Mr. Biden was slated to go to Angola in Southwest Africa just a few days ago, but he canceled the trip, supposedly because of Hurricane Milton and the aftermath of Helene. I had thought, actually, that he was canceling the trip so that he could confer in the Situation Room with regard to an impending attack on Iran by Israel. And I still hold to that particular notion. And it would have been ironic indeed if Mr. Biden had shown up in Angola because, of course, his predecessors in 1975 sought, along with apartheid South Africa, to thwart Angolan independence. And it took the dispatching of thousands of Cuban troops to make Angolan independence come to a reality. But we know that with the sanctions on oil-producing nations like Venezuela, like Russia, like Iran, that Washington has become ever more dependent upon Angolan petroleum, and that helps to explain Mr. Biden's proposed trip. Not to mention the fact of seeking to gain leverage against South Africa. South Africa is not in the good books of Washington because of its bringing the case before the International Court of Justice against U.S. ally Israel. Seeking to gain leverage against South Africa was another purpose of this now canceled trip, which is one of the reasons why I think that Mr. Biden will probably be heading to Angola, particularly after the U.S. election in November, if not December.
We have just about a minute and a half. Is that really just whistling past the graveyard? And one of the and what makes me ask that question are the recent reports. I think it's Mali that's going to start launching satellites in cooperation with a program with Russia. Are they really trying to close the barn door after the cows have left?
Well, certainly Washington, like France, has many problems in Africa. The Sahel nations, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in particular, not to mention the fact that this Kenyan intervention in Haiti is not going very well. And so Mr. Biden's proposed trip to Angola was an attempt to put lipstick on a pig, but I dare say that that will not work very well.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate your analysis. Again, you've been one of the cornerstones of this program, and we are forever, forever grateful for your contribution. Thank you, sir.